Just when Tilda had stopped thinking about Martin Alquist every morning and night, the telephone rang in her little kitchen. It was Martin. "I just wanted to see how you were." "Fine," she said eventually. "Do you fancy having a visitor?" "No." It isn't Martin who's ringing, she thought. It's his hormones. He just wants a change from his wife again. The worst of it was that she still wanted him to come over. Preferably that very night. It was sick. Tilda worked long hours. In the evenings, she got into her own little Ford and drove around getting to know Åland. It was during one of these outings that she finally found the van Edla Gustafsson had mentioned. It said Kalmar Pipes and Welding on the sides, and it was black. Tilda made a note of the registration number and reversed into a parking space a little further along. Then she called the central control number. She asked them to check out a firm called Kalmar Pipes and Welding, but no such firm was registered. After 50 minutes, two powerfully built men, aged around 25, stopped by the dark van. The van drove away. Tilda followed. Eventually, they reached a high-rise apartment block not far from the hospital, and the van slowed down and pulled in by the curb. The men got out and disappeared through a doorway. Tilda quickly wrote down the address. If these were the burglars, then at least she now knew where they lived. "I'd given up on the investigation into Katrine Weston's death," said Tilda as she was having coffee with Gerloff a couple of evenings later. "Her murder, you mean?" "It wasn't a murder." "Oh, yes," said Gerloff. "I think it was." "Really?" "A few years before the war," Gerloff went on, "two cargo ships were moored up side by side. But aboard one was a first mate, and aboard the other an ordinary seaman. They got into an argument about something, and stood yelling at each other across the gunwales. Then it got serious. In the end, the guy from Davidsson jumped up onto the gunwale to get across to the other ship, but he didn't get far, because his opponent met him with a boat hook. This was a sturdy wooden pole with a big iron hook on one end. So when this lap came hurtling over the gunwale, his shirt got caught on the hook, and he stopped in mid-air. Then he fell straight down like a stone into the water between the ships, with his shirt still tangled up on the boat hook. And he didn't come up again, because the other man was holding him under the water." He looked at Tilda. "The rest of us broke up the fight and got him out. But he only just made it. Anyway, it was that fight I was thinking of when I asked to see Katrine Weston's clothes," he said. "And now I've had a look at them." He took an item of clothing out of the paper bag. It was a grey cotton top with a hood. "The murderer came to Eel Point by boat," said Gerloff. "He put in by the stone jetty, where Katrine Weston was waiting, and she stayed where she was. So she must have trusted him. He was holding a boat hook, which he twisted into the hood of her top. Then he used it to drag her down into the water. Then he held her down until it was over." Gerloff spread the top out on the table, and Tilda saw that the hood was torn. Something sharp had ripped 2-inch-long holes in the grey fabric. "You can have the clothes back," said Gerloff, handing over the brown package to Joachim on the other side of the table. "Did you get anything out of them?" "Perhaps. But you don't want to tell me what it was?" "Soon," said Gerloff. "When I've finished thinking." Joachim had never visited an old people's home, but he was sitting here now, drinking coffee in silence in Gerloff Davidsson's. "I have to pick up my children in an hour," he said. "Can we talk for a while?" "Of course," said Gerloff. For a long time, Joachim had wanted to talk to someone about what had happened in the autumn, someone who knew Eel Point. "I never asked you when you came out to the house, but do you believe in ghosts?" Gerloff shook his head. "I neither believe nor don't believe," he said. Joachim shifted in his seat and looked down at the parcel of clothes. "I'm worried about my daughter, Livia," he said. "She's 6 years old, and she talks in her sleep. She always has done, but since my wife died, she's started to dream about her." "Is that so strange?" said Gerloff. "I dream about my late wife sometimes, and she's been dead for many years." "Yes, But it's the same dream, over and over again. Livia dreams that her mother comes to Eel Point, but can't get into the house. Gerloff listened in silence. And sometimes she dreams about Ethel too, Joachim went on. That's what worries me most. Who's Ethel? Asked Gerloff. She was my sister. She was 3 years older than me. Joachim sighed. That's my own ghost story. Sort of. Tell me about her, said Gerloff quietly. Joachim nodded wearily. Ethel was a drug addict, he said. There was always an empty chair at the table. Ethel would be in the city centre looking for drugs. For her, that was just everyday life. My father used to go out looking in the evenings before he got too sick. I did too. On the streets, in the squares, in the underground stations, and the emergency psychiatric wards. We soon learned where she might be. 2 years ago, Ethel had been in rehab that winter, and it had gone well. She had been clean for almost 3 months, so we let her stay in our guest room. She used to play a lot with Livia in the evenings. They got on really well. One evening in March, Katrine and I went to see a film, he went on. When we got back to the house, there was only Gabriel, sleeping in his cot. Ethel had gone, and she had taken 2 things with her, my mobile phone and Livia. I found Ethel in the end, he said, looking at Gerloff. She was lying in the dark graveyard at Clara Church. She had curled up next to a tomb and passed out. Livia was sitting beside her in thin clothes, ice-cold and apathetic. I called an ambulance and made sure Ethel went into detox again. Then I drove home to Broma with Livia. He fell silent. Katrine made me choose after that, and I chose my family. You made the right choice, said Gerloff. And that night I told Ethel not to come near our house any more, but she did. We didn't let her in, but in the evenings she would stand at our gate, just stand there, yelling. Katrine started to wish that Ethel would die. And that's what happened. Yes, eventually. Ethel had gone down to the walkway by the shore, said Joachim. She had sat down by a boathouse and pushed the needle in. Then she had tumbled into the freezing water. And that was the end of her. Gerloff sat in silence, apparently lost in thought. What did Ethel want? He said. Why did she keep on coming to your house? Was it just to get money for drugs? Joachim pulled on his jacket without answering. Not just that, he said eventually. She wanted her daughter back as well. Her daughter? There was no father. He died of an overdose. Katrine and I were Livia's godparents, and social services awarded her care to us 4 years ago. We adopted her last year. Livia is ours now. But she's Ethel's child, said Gerloff. Not any longer. 2 weeks had passed without a single reported break-in in Northern Öland. But one morning the telephone rang in the police station. Tilda recognized the name. John Hagman was one of Gerloff's friends. I hear you're looking for people who've been breaking into houses, he said. They've been here in the village. I'll come down and take a look, said Tilda. Tilda got out of the police car on a gravel track in the middle of a row of closed-up summer cottages. A short, elderly man in dark blue dungarees and a brown cap came over to the car. He nodded briefly and pointed to a dark brown one-story house with wide windows. There, he said. I noticed it had blown open. Same thing next door. When Tilda went closer, she could see that the frame was split and broken open near the catch. The room inside was a mess. The traces left by the burglars were clearly visible. Any unusual traffic in the area? No, said Hagman. I mean, the owners go home to the city in August every year. In September, there was a firm out here replacing some floors, but since then, there hasn't... Tilda looked at him. A flooring company? It wasn't a plumbing firm, said Tilda. Kalmar Pipes and Welding. Hagman shook his head. They were laying floors, he said. Laying floors, said Tilda. She remembered the newly polished floor at the vicarage in Haggleby. and wondered if she'd found a pattern. When Tilda got back to the station, she called a dozen or so owners of cottages on Åland or in the Kalmar area who had reported break-ins during the autumn. 4 of the owners had had floors sanded or replaced in their summer cottages earlier in the year. They had used a local firm. Tilda called the owner of Marnus Fine Flooring to find out the names of the men who had been working in northern Åland. He gave her 2, Niklas Lindell, Henrik Jansson. Tilda was able to establish that of the 22 house owners who had had work done on their floors, 7 had reported break-ins over the past 3 months. Niklas Lindell had worked in 2 of the houses, but Henrik Jansson had worked in all of them. The silence was broken by the telephone. "Hi, Tilda. How are you?" said Martin. "Fine," she said, "but I don't have time right now. I'm in the middle of something important. But Tilda, bye." She put down the phone. It felt like a liberation. The strong wind died away before dawn, and when the sun rose next morning, Joachim saw that a thin layer of snow was still covering everything. Down on the shore, the waves had hurled ice up to form wide banks. Joachim peered towards the horizon, but the line between sea and sky had disappeared in dazzling mist. The telephone rang after breakfast. It was Tilda Davidsson. "Joachim, you said before that your wife didn't have any visitors at the house, but I heard you had someone laying floors," said Tilda. Now Joachim remembered. "Yes," he said, "but it was before I moved here." "Did you ever meet him?" asked Tilda. "No, but Katrine did. One more thing. Have you had any uninvited guests during the autumn?" "Uninvited?" said Joachim, his thoughts immediately turning to Ethel. "Anyone trying to break in, I mean," said Tilda. "No, we haven't had anything like that." Tilda had brought a bottle with her as a present. "It's fun to talk, isn't it? I've found out so much about grandfather." Gerloff seemed hesitant. "But I haven't told you about the most important part yet. Ragnar taught me a great deal about the weather and the winds and fishing and sailing when I was a kid. But when I got a little older, I realised I couldn't trust him. I realised that my brother was dishonest. Ragnar was a thief," he went on. "Nothing more than a thief. I can't make it sound any better, unfortunately." "So what did he take?" asked Tilda quietly. "Well, he stole everything he could, by and large. He always kept an eye open for something that was left unlocked or unwatched. I don't think about my older brother too often. Ragnar was a shit." When she got back to the police station, the light on the answering machine was flashing. She started to listen to the message, but when she heard Martin's voice, she pressed delete. It was time he gave up. This was the shortest day of the year. When Livia and Gabriel had fallen asleep that evening and everything was quiet in the house, Joachim put on his padded jacket and left the house with a torch in his hand. He was going to visit the barn. He took a walk round the ground floor first. Someone had swept the stone floor, not everywhere, but in a strip next to the walls. It could hardly be anyone other than Katrine who had swept in here. In the right-hand corner, on the gable wall, old fishing nets and thick ropes hung from a row of nails. Several of them reached right down to the floor, like a curtain. But behind the curtain, the wall appeared to sink inwards. Part of the wooden wall was missing, and when Joachim pushed the curtain of ropes, there was some kind of opening by the floor in the gable wall. It only reached up to Joachim's knees. He lay down on his belly and wriggled under. There was another wall in front of him. It must be the outside wall. The space between was only about 3 feet wide. A couple of yards away, an old wooden ladder led straight up into the darkness. He started to climb. Eventually, he heaved himself up from the ladder. He had found the hidden room behind the hayloft. He stood up and swept the torch around in front of him. In its yellow glow, he saw benches, rows of benches. He was at one end of something that looked like an old wooden chapel. a little room set out with 4 benches and a narrow aisle alongside them. In the glow of the torch, he could see letters lying on them, and dried-up bunches of flowers, and a pair of children's white shoes, possessions, mementos, a folded cloth bundle, a pale blue tattered denim jacket, which Joachim thought he had seen before. He knew whose jacket it was. It was his sister Ethel's. Henrik knew the police were looking for him. He needed to get rid of the evidence. As usual, there was nobody around by the boathouse. The idea of hiding some of the stolen goods came to him as he stood inside the boathouse looking at everything they had collected during the autumn. Henrik had no real idea what was there, and he was sure the brothers hadn't either. His boat wasn't registered anywhere. There was no way the police could know he had it. Once he had taken it to the industrial estate outside Borgholm, he could drive out there and pick up the stolen goods whenever he wanted. Henrik decided to go for it. Eventually, he had carried over a dozen or so items and hidden them between the seats in the boat. He fetched a green tarpaulin from the boathouse, pulled it over the boat from prow to stern, and fastened it with a long nylon rope. When Henrik went back to lock the boathouse, he heard a dull roar through the soughing of the wind. He turned his head. Through the trees he could see a vehicle approaching. A dark van. The Sørelius brothers pulled in next to Henrik's boat. "Hi there, Henrik!" The brothers walked towards him through the snow, both smiling. "We've come to collect stuff as well," said Tommy. Tommy went past him and walked over to the boat. Henrik's pulse rate increased. He should have got more ropes and knotted them tightly over the tarpaulin. In order to distract Tommy, he started talking. "Do you know what I saw out here back in the autumn?" "No." Tommy shook his head, but didn't take his eyes off the boat. "It was in October," said Henrik. "When I was here emptying the boat, I saw a motor cruiser. Must have come from the north. It put in up by the lighthouses at Eel Point. There was a man standing in the prow, and that evening they found her drowned in just the same place. I've thought about it a lot." He was talking too much and too quickly. But now at last Tommy turned his head. "Who are you talking about?" "The woman from the manor house up there," said Henrik. "Katrine Westin. I did some work for her last summer." "Eel Point," said Tommy. "That's where we're going." Tommy pulled the tarpaulin hard over to one side. "Uh-huh," said Tommy, looking down at the objects in the boat. Then he pointed at the ground. "You should have swept away the tracks in the snow, Henky. You've been shuttling back and forth between the boathouse and the boat." Henrik took a step backwards. Tommy wasn't listening. He struck out, fetching Henrik a hard blow in the stomach and making him stagger backwards. There was a rock behind him. He slumped down on it and looked at the ground. His jacket was ripped. Tommy quickly went through Henrik's pockets and fished out the car keys. He just sat there on the rock, watching the Sørelius brothers. Freddie climbed unhurriedly in behind the wheel of the van. Tommy settled himself in Henrik's Saab. The brothers were stealing both his car and his boat, and all Henrik could do was watch. Henrik saw both the car and the trailer disappear slowly towards the coast road. Eventually, he took his hand away from his stomach and looked. The tear in his grey padded jacket was coloured red now. After a while, he managed to get up from the rock. He was actually able to walk. His intestines and his liver must be okay. With his hand pressed against his belly, he started to walk towards his boathouse. Henrik made his way over to his grandfather's workbench. Algott's old wood axe was lying there. He took the axe, then he set off into the snow. The Sørelius brothers had struck him down and stolen his boat, and they had talked about going up to Eel Point, in which case Henrik intended to meet them there. Tilda rang the doorbell of Henrik Janssen's flat. A teenage girl was coming up the stairs. Tilda said, "We're looking for your neighbour, Henrik. Do you know where he is?" The girl thought about it. "It could be at the boathouse." "Where's that?" "On the east coast somewhere." "Good," said Tilda. "Have a great Christmas." A broad-shouldered man was sitting in one of the armchairs in Tilda's waiting room. It was Martin Alquist. "What do you think you're doing?" "What do you mean?" said Martin. "You keep on calling me, and now you turn up here. Why?" "Well, I wanted to see how you were." "I haven't got time to talk now. There's a guy I have to pick up." She walked out to the car park. Then she started the engine and pulled away. She saw a blue Mazda pull out behind her. Martin was following her. By the time Tilda reached the eastern side of the island, the daylight was almost completely gone, and the silently falling snow had become more intrusive. When she turned off onto the narrow track down towards Enslunda, Martin's Mazda was still a little way behind her. It was bitterly cold and desolate here at the edge of the Baltic. The cold and the emptiness made the entire coast feel menacing. The waves were rolling in and had begun to break up the covering of ice offshore. Martin got out of his car and walked over to Tilda. "This guy you're going to pick up, is he supposed to be out here?" She just nodded. The door of one of the boathouses was banging to and fro in the wind. Martin opened the door and peered in. "He's not home." Tilda didn't reply. She went inside and bent down. Small, shiny droplets could be seen on the wooden floor. "What do you make of this?" "Fresh blood," he said. Tilda went outside and looked around. There were indistinct tracks in the snow, a long line of footprints leading north. Tilda turned around and headed back towards the car. "Where are you going?" shouted Martin behind her. "It's confidential," she replied, and carried on to the police car. Snow was falling thickly now. In her wing mirror she saw Martin following her. Tilda increased her speed before she looked to the east and saw that the horizon had disappeared. A grey-white wall of snow hung over the sea. It was dropping rapidly towards the coast. A storm was on its way. Joachim went along the stone pathway between the buildings, out into the wind and the snow. He remembered Gerloff's warning that you could get lost if you went out in a blizzard. Joachim walked into the barn, and it felt as if the wind were pushing at his back, as if it wanted to come with him, but he slammed the door shut. Inside the false wall, he stood up and switched on the torch. He could see the ladder leading up into the darkness. Joachim listened, but everything was still silent in the barn. He could stand here or start climbing. He hesitated. Just for a moment, he considered the fact that a storm was coming and Livy and Gabriel were alone in the house. Then he lifted his right foot and placed it on the bottom rung. Joachim's mouth was dry and his heart was pounding, but he was more expectant than afraid. He didn't want to be anywhere else but where he was now. Katrine was close. He could feel it. The wind along the coast had increased to storm force. The gusts shook the car, and Tilda clutched the wheel tightly. Blizzard, she thought. The road in front of the car disappeared completely. Tilda turned the wheel as the road curved, but not enough. Suddenly the front wheel sank down into the snow. The police car stopped with a violent bang. A second later she felt an even bigger bang. Martin's car had driven into hers. In the rear-view mirror, she saw Martin open his car door and step out into the snow. Tilda opened her door as well. "You were too close," she said through the wind. "You slammed the brakes on," he shouted back. She shook her head. "Nobody asked you to follow me, Martin." "Well, you've got a radio car," he said. "Call the breakdown truck." Martin got back in the Mazda, and Tilda struggled back to the warmth and quiet of the police car. Once inside, she used the radio to call Borgholm. "What's the situation?" asked Tilda. "Chaos. More or less complete chaos. Where are you?" "By Ofamosen, on the eastern coast," said Tilda. "I'm stuck." "Do you need help? The snowplows are only working on the main roads." "I'll be fine. If it gets colder, I'll just make my way to the nearest house." "Understood. Good luck." Martin wound down the window as he reached his car. "Is someone coming?" She shook her head and shouted back. "We can't stay here." "What?" Tilda pointed eastwards. "There's a house! Down there!" A few seconds later, he got out of the car. Tilda led the way towards Eel Point, with Martin a few steps behind her. Henrik Jansson was fighting his way through the blinding snow. He hung on to the axe. He had to rest after every other step. The wind had increased in strength yet again, although Henrik had thought that that was impossible. He stopped and closed his eyes. Was death warm or cold? Somewhere in his head were the Sorelius brothers with their broad smiles. That got him moving again. A room for the dead, with its own church benches. Ethel's jacket had been lying there neatly folded among all the other old mementos. It was Katrine who had put it there. She must have found the room during the autumn without telling Joachim. His wife had kept secrets from him. Joachim stood in the barn listening to the wind roaring over the huge roof. He shone the torch on the denim jacket lying there, neatly folded. Joachim reached out and felt the worn fabric, as if touching it could provide answers to all his questions. When he got hold of one sleeve, something rustled and fell on the floor. It was a small piece of paper. He bent down and picked it up, and saw a single sentence written in ink. "Make sure that junkie whore disappears." This was not a message to Ethel. This had been written to him and Katrine. But he had never seen it before. Katrine must have found it, pushed through the door one day. Joachim was very tired now, and sank down on the bench next to Ethel's jacket. He carried on staring at the note in his hand, until he heard a faint scraping noise through the wind. It was coming from the opening in the floor behind him. Someone was inside the barn.